Amidst the wilds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the winds howled and the cold gnawed at the bones of any man who dared venture, one mountaineer defied nature itself. His secret? A fire pit so ingeniously built that it withstood howling storms, even when every other hearth in the valley was extinguished. Before we begin, let us know where you're tuning in from, and hit that subscribe button because next time we'll reveal how this man's quiet invention reshaped the future of survival in the wild. The Appalachian winter arrived earlier than expected that year, a cruel reminder of the harshness of the mountains. Jonathan Calloway, a man accustomed to the wilderness, had seen his fair share of snowstorms, but nothing like this. The wind had picked up strength in a way that felt personal, howling down from the ridges with a biting cold that could freeze a man to his very marrow. Sitting inside his humble cabin, Jonathan stared into the fireplace, the flames flickering weakly, threatened by the gusts that came through cracks in the stone walls. His cabin, no stranger to the wrath of nature, was holding strong, but the hearth was another matter. The fire crackled feebly, its light struggling to keep the frost from creeping in. Outside, the storm raged on. The swirling snow was a blur of white, so thick that even the dense pine trees appeared as shadows against the howling storm. Jonathan knew what was coming. He had witnessed this kind of weather before, but he didn't know if his fire would survive. With a glance at the cabin's door, he stood up, wrapping a thick woolen coat around his shoulders. He made his way to the small fire pit he'd carefully built just outside the cabin's entrance. It was a simple design stone, well crafted, nothing overly complicated. But Jonathan had put in the work, learning from years of trial and error. He knew this fire pit could withstand anything the wilds could throw at it. But this storm was different. A fierce wind swirled through the mountain pass, pushing everything before it, determined to snuff out every flame in its path. Jonathan's heart quickened, the weight of past winters pushing down on him as he reached the fire pit. The small flames inside flickered, their dance in the wind unyielding. The storm pressed in from all sides, yet the fire stood its ground. His fingers trembled as he crouched down, adding a few more logs to the pit. The storm roared, howling in fury, but the fire pit held. For the first time, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had created something that could survive this wild place. It had been weeks since the storm, but the wind didn't relent. Jonathan's fire pit, a small and seemingly insignificant detail of his life, had become a point of obsession. Each day, he tended to the fire outside, adding logs, watching as the winds howled around him, yet never once able to completely snuff the flames. Each night, as the temperature plummeted, he felt the warmth of the fire pit seep into his bones, a silent testament to the ingenuity he had crafted. Jonathan had lived in the mountains his entire life, but this was something different. The fire pit's resilience wasn't just about the stone or the wood, it was something deeper. A reflection of the mountain's own brutal power and the man's refusal to bow before it. No other mountaineer could claim to have a hearth that would stand its ground through such storms. In the small settlements scattered throughout the region, men were starting to talk. It was impossible not to notice that while every other hearth faltered under the onslaught of the storm, Jonathan's fire pit blazed ever brighter, an enduring symbol of the mountaineer's will to survive. Each conversation in the local tavern, every exchange at the market, inevitably turned toward Jonathan's creation. How had he done it? What secret lay behind his seemingly simple design? His neighbors watched on him from a distance, skeptical but curious. And yet, Jonathan refused to share the method behind his success. For now, he kept his secret close, as the storm continued to rage outside. There were no immediate answers, only the cold winds and the warm fire that seemed to mock the wilderness itself. The more Jonathan watched the fire, the more he realized it wasn't just the physical construction of the pit that made it work, it was his understanding of the environment. He'd spent years watching the wind, listening to its language, learning its patterns. The storm wasn't merely an obstacle, it was something to be understood, something he could use to his advantage. One evening, after the storm had briefly subsided, Jonathan sat alone by the fire, contemplating the coming days. The fire pit's success had sparked something in him, a drive to understand the wilderness more deeply. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was learning, adapting, and mastering his environment. He would not let the storms claim the hearths of men. He would build one that could endure all things. As the weeks passed, Jonathan's mind became more consumed by the fire pit. It wasn't just the practicality of having a fire that could withstand the elements, it was the idea of mastery, of claiming control over the mountain that had always seemed so untamable. He had built the fire pit with no great ambition beyond keeping warm and cooking his meals, but now, as winter's grip tightened, the fire's resilience became symbolic of something much deeper. Every time the wind screamed through the trees or the snow swirled in blinding gusts, Jonathan found himself drawn to the fire, watching it flicker and roar defiantly against the storm. It was no longer merely a tool for survival. It had become a puzzle, a challenge that Jonathan couldn't let go of. He began to experiment with different placements for the stones, adjusting the angles, shaping the space around the pit with more precision. Each new attempt was a small tweak, but every small change revealed something new. The way the fire responded to wind from different directions, the way it adapted to the shifting patterns of the storm, it was all part of a larger picture, one that Jonathan hadn't fully understood yet. But with each new piece of knowledge, he moved closer to a revelation. It wasn't until one particularly brutal night that the answer came to him. Jonathan had been sitting by the fire, his face warmed by the orange glow, when he noticed something peculiar. The storm had grown fiercer, and the howling wind outside was loud enough to drown out all other sounds. Yet, the fire pit remained strong. He looked closely at the angle of the wind as it struck the rocks surrounding the fire. That was when it hit him. The key wasn't in the fire, but in the way the pit was designed to channel the wind. His mind raced as he pieced the idea together. The rocks around the fire weren't simply a boundary, they were a tool to harness the wind's force, directing it to feed the flames instead of dousing them. Jonathan's design, in essence, was a windbreak that didn't just shield the fire, but used the storm's energy to stoke it, rather than extinguish it. With this realization, Jonathan's obsession turned into a relentless pursuit of perfecting the design. He spent hours each day, testing, adjusting, refining, each new step more purposeful than the last. The mountain had kept its secret from him for years, but now, with his growing understanding of the forces around him, Jonathan was starting to unravel the delicate dance between nature and ingenuity. But as he worked, something stirred in the depths of his heart, a sense that this invention was bigger than just his own survival. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this design, this simple fire pit, could change the way men survived in the harshest conditions. This secret, hidden in plain sight, was a key to enduring the unforgiving wilderness. By the time spring arrived, Jonathan's fire pit had become a quiet legend in the region. The storm had passed, but the winds didn't let up, and neither did Jonathan's obsession. Word of his invention had spread through the small, scattered communities along the mountain range. At first, it was just a passing conversation, something to be whispered around the campfire after a long day of trapping, but soon it became something more. Other men, hungry for solutions to their own survival struggles, began to seek him out. Some came cautiously, not quite believing the rumors of a fire that could withstand the fiercest of winds. Others arrived with open minds, eager to learn, hoping that Jonathan might hold the answer to a question they hadn't known how to ask. The first to visit Jonathan was a trapper named Elias, who had heard the stories while passing through the nearby settlement. He arrived at Jonathan's cabin in the late afternoon, his face lined with weariness and a questioning look in his eyes. "You're the one with the fire pit," Elias said, his voice rough from the cold and the long trek. Jonathan studied him for a moment before replying, "I suppose I am. You come to see if the rumors are true?" Elias nodded. "Some say it can stand through the worst storms. I've seen men lose everything to the wind fires, snuffed out before they could even cook a meal. I've lost my own cabin to it before." He paused, looking over at the fire. "I reckon I'd like to see how it works." Jonathan led him outside to the fire pit. It had been a week since the last heavy winds had passed, but Elias could still feel the mountain's chill in the air. Jonathan didn't need to explain. He simply demonstrated the pit's resilience, starting the fire with little more than a few dry branches and kindling. The wind that day was mild, but Jonathan's experience with the elements meant he could predict how it would behave in a storm. As the fire grew, Elias watched in awe, his skepticism fading with each passing minute. The flames swayed, dancing in the wind, but never faltered. They burned bright, untouched by the elements that had so often defeated men in the past. "How is this possible?" Elias asked, his voice full of awe. Jonathan grinned. "It's all in the way you work with the wind. Instead of fighting it, you learn to use it." He gestured to the fire. "This pit channels the wind in a way that feeds the fire rather than smothering it." Elias stood for a long moment, silent, watching the flames flicker against the storm's embrace. "You've done it," he said finally. "This could save lives." Word spread quickly from there. Trappers, hunters, and even settlers who were looking to carve out a life in the mountains began to seek Jonathan's wisdom. The design was simple, but its potential was immense. It wasn't just about the fire, it was about understanding the land, learning how to use what the wilderness offered instead of merely surviving it. And so, Jonathan found himself at the heart of something he hadn't planned for, a community that looked to him not just for shelter from the storm, but for the hope that came with ingenuity and understanding. The more Jonathan's fire pit was discussed, the more he realized that his creation was not just a local curiosity, it was the answer to something larger. People were traveling from distant areas to see the hearth that survived storms, drawn by stories of its unmatched resilience. And with every visitor, Jonathan was confronted with a realization that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The simple mountain man had become a symbol of survival in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. It wasn't just about keeping warm anymore. It was about survival in its purest form. The fire pit had become a metaphor for the larger battle against the wilderness. A blank wilderness that, no matter how many men tamed it, would always fight back. Jonathan knew that, in many ways, his life in the mountains had been about isolation, about proving himself to the land itself. But now, the winds were bringing more than just cold, they were bringing attention. Visitors were not the only ones seeking him out. Those with power, wealth, and status in the nearby towns were beginning to take an interest too. The fire pit, simple as it seemed, was becoming a commodity, a symbol of endurance that was hard to ignore. He sat one evening by the fire, the crackling warmth flickering in the growing twilight, his mind adrift with thoughts of the world outside his cabin. He thought about the men who had begun arriving in groups, the small caravans of settlers, hoping for a piece of his knowledge, and the trapper who had arrived one morning with an offer he couldn't quite refuse. The man, Elias, had spoken of a nearby settlement where timber was abundant and a more permanent structure could be established. The idea lingered in Jonathan's mind like a passing breeze, unsettling yet strangely alluring. A life outside of the mountains was something he had never truly entertained. But now, with his invention spreading beyond his isolated cabin, the pull of the outside world seemed harder to ignore. Despite the strange sense of opportunity, Jonathan remained rooted in his belief that survival was at the heart of it all. The wild didn't care for status or wealth, and he wasn't sure if the world outside could truly understand the simplicity of what he had created, a fire that survived, against all odds. As he sat by the fire that night, Jonathan knew he was on the verge of something important, something that could change the lives of many men and women. But he also knew that, in many ways, his journey was just beginning. His time as a solitary man of the mountains was ending, and the call of the wild was becoming more distant with each passing day. The following week, a man arrived at Jonathan's cabin that would forever change the course of his journey. Unlike the usual trappers and settlers, this man was different. Dressed in a fine woolen coat and boots polished to a sheen, he looked out of place in the wilderness. Jonathan, who was accustomed to the rough-hewn men of the mountain, couldn't help but eye the newcomer with suspicion. The man introduced himself as Benjamin Clark, a landowner from the nearby valley. His posture was stiff, his speech deliberate, as though every word had been carefully chosen. Yet, beneath the veneer of wealth and status, there was something raw in his eyes, an earnestness that Jonathan could not ignore. "I've heard of your fire pit," Benjamin began, his voice steady but respectful. "I've heard that it can withstand the fiercest winds, that it burns when others are extinguished." Jonathan nodded, his gaze wary. He had no interest in the trappings of wealth. But Benjamin's next words caught him off guard. "I need your help," Benjamin continued. There are settlers who have come west, seeking a place to call home. But the storms are brutal, and our hearths go out in the cold winds. I need something more reliable. Something that can withstand nature's fury." Jonathan could hear the desperation in his voice, the plea for something simple yet profound. This man, it seemed, was no different than the others who had come to him. They all wanted survival, but they couldn't quite grasp what it truly meant. "I've built what I've built because I needed to survive," Jonathan said, his words slow, deliberate. "I didn't make it for profit or for praise." "I understand," Benjamin replied, "but think of the lives that could be saved. Think of how many could benefit from what you've done. Your fire pit could change everything for us, could save more lives than you might realize." For a moment, Jonathan was silent, the weight of the planus, Benjamin's words hanging in the cold air. He had never thought of his invention in such grand terms. To him, it had always been a personal challenge, a way to endure, a tool to survive. But now, as he looked into the eyes of this stranger, he began to see the fire pit through a different lens. "I'm not a builder, and I'm certainly no man of commerce," Jonathan said, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "But I've made it clear that survival isn't something you can buy, it's something you have to earn." Benjamin stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "I don't want to buy your secret, Jonathan. I want to help you spread it. We can work together, help the settlers, the families. You can keep your privacy, your independence, but together we can make this accessible to all who need it." Jonathan studied the man for a long moment. He could sense something genuine in Benjamin's offer, but the question lingered in the back of his mind: was it a partnership or a transaction? And, more importantly, was he ready to leave his solitary life behind to pursue this new venture? Finally, after a long pause, Jonathan spoke. "All right," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll help you, but we do it on my terms." Benjamin smiled, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something that would shape their lives forever. As Jonathan began to work with Benjamin, the days grew longer and the air warmer. But despite the passing seasons, Jonathan's commitment to his fire pit remained unshaken. The partnership with Benjamin had opened new doors, though Jonathan still couldn't fully shake his skepticism. He had always been a man of action, preferring solitude and simplicity to the complications of business and contracts. But now, as the settlers gathered, the gravity of what he had built began to weigh on him. Together, Jonathan and Benjamin set out to establish a workshop where settlers could learn the art of the fire pit's construction. It wasn't much at first, just a small, sturdy building on the outskirts of the valley, with walls made of timber and a roof that echoed the hard, unforgiving reality of the land they lived in. But it was a start. Benjamin's influence ensured that they had enough resources, tools, labor, and material, but it was Jonathan's expertise that guided the way. Every day, he worked tirelessly, teaching the settlers, showing them how to stack stones and shape the earth. He explained the wind, the elements, and the nature of the mountain in ways they hadn't understood before. As the weeks passed, the workshop became a hub of activity, and more settlers came from distant towns, drawn by the promise of a fire that would never fail. But on one particular evening, a test came that Jonathan hadn't expected. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the valley in a way that felt almost unnatural. It was the kind of wind that could break trees and topple the fragile homes that dotted the landscape. Benjamin, already aware of the danger, rushed to Jonathan's side. "Is your fire pit ready?" Benjamin asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "The storm is stronger than we thought." Jonathan had been confident in the fire pit's design, but this was different. This wasn't just a test of the fire, it was a test of everything they had built. The settlers, who had worked so hard under Jonathan's guidance, stood nervously outside the workshop, their eyes on him, waiting for him to act. Without a word, Jonathan moved toward the fire pit that had been constructed outside the building. The storm was fierce now, and the wind carried with it the cold bite of winter. Jonathan's hands were steady as he prepared the fire, adding the kindling with care. The flames ignited quickly, the fire dancing brightly in the pit as the wind howled louder. Jonathan stepped back, watching the flames bend and twist, but never falter. It worked. His class, design, his labor, and his trust in the elements had paid off. The storm tested their resilience, but the fire pit stood firm. The settlers watched in awe, their fears easing as they realized that what Jonathan had built wasn't just a product of one man's desire to survive, it was a force of nature itself, as unyielding and enduring as the mountains they had come to call home. The storm passed, but the winds didn't die down immediately. For several days, the valley remained in its grip, the gusts relentless and cold. But the fire pit had passed its test with flying colors, and Jonathan's confidence began to grow. As the settlers gathered around their newfound hearths, the significance of his creation was becoming clearer. For the first time, Jonathan felt a deep sense of pride not just in his work, but in the legacy that he was creating. The fire pits weren't just practical, they were part of something larger. They represented survival, yes, but also a sense of community. The settlers who had come to him for help were now learning to help each other. They were building something that went beyond shelters and tools. They were building hope. One morning, after the storm had passed, Benjamin arrived with a proposal that Jonathan knew was inevitable, yet still hesitant to accept. "You've done more than I ever expected," Benjamin said, standing beside Jonathan in the light of the new day. "These fire pits are going to change the way we live out here. I know it. The settlers, they're already talking about expansion, about building new communities, ones that can survive anything the wilderness throws at them. We could take this further, Jonathan. I can see the potential for a much larger operation. What if we turn this into something bigger?" Jonathan paused, turning to face Benjamin. He had seen the glimmer in the man's eyes, the same look that had once guided Jonathan to survival. But this was different. It was a vision not of mere survival, but of growth, of thriving in a world that was harsh and unforgiving. "I'm not a businessman," Jonathan said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years spent alone in the wilderness. "I've never wanted more than what I can build with my own hands. I've made my peace with the mountains." "I understand," Benjamin said, nodding, "but this isn't about taking away what you've built. It's about sharing it. I'm not asking you to leave the mountains, Jonathan. I'm asking you to help others live here as you have. You've given them the tools to survive. Now, let's give them a chance to thrive." Jonathan looked around the valley, his gaze lingering on the settlers who had gathered, watching him with admiration and gratitude. There was no turning back now. The fire pit had become more than just a tool, it was a symbol of something deeper, the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of the community, the power to adapt and grow, even in the harshest conditions. Finally, Jonathan nodded. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "Let's build something that will last." And with that, a new chapter began, not just for Jonathan, but for everyone who had come to him for help. The fire pit had become the heart of a new way of life, one that would burn bright for generations to come. The valley was changing, and Jonathan could feel it in the air. The fire pits were no longer just a curiosity, they were the foundation of a new way of life. What had started as a humble solution to a problem had turned into something far larger than Jonathan had ever imagined. Settlers were no longer just surviving, they were thriving, and they owed much of that success to Jonathan's ingenuity. As word spread, more people came to the valley, drawn by the promise of a place where the storm didn't have to be feared, where a fire could burn no matter how fierce the winds. Benjamin, ever the businessman, worked tirelessly to turn their small operation into something greater. He brought in more supplies, built additional workshops, and expanded the team that would help teach settlers how to build the fire pits for themselves. It wasn't long before the valley had become a thriving community, all built around Jonathan's design. Despite the growth, Jonathan remained focused. The simple fire pit was still his priority, still the heart of everything they were building. But as the demand for his invention grew, so too did the pressure. He found himself pulled between the quiet solace of his cabin and the increasing responsibility of guiding the settlement. The isolation he had once cherished now seemed distant, replaced by the constant hum of people coming and going, all eager to learn from the man who had changed their lives. He couldn't deny that he felt a sense of pride. His fire pits were everywhere, from the farthest cabins to the central gathering spaces. They had become symbols of resilience, of hope in a world that had often seemed determined to crush them. And yet, as the years went on, Jonathan began to wonder if the life he had created here was everything he had hoped for. Was he just another cog in a growing machine? Or was he still the same man who had once walked into the mountains with nothing but the desire to survive? One evening, after the day's work had ended and the last of the settlers had gone back to their homes, Jonathan stood at the edge of the valley, looking out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the land, and for a brief moment Jonathan felt the weight of everything he had accomplished. The fire pit had given birth to an entire way of life, one that would outlast the storms and the hardships of the wilderness. But it wasn't just the physical structures that mattered. It was the spirit of the people that had come together around those fires, the unspoken bond that had formed between settlers, all of them drawn to the same place by the same necessity. Jonathan had created a tool, but it was the community that had made it something more. Benjamin joined him at the edge of the valley, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," he said quietly. Jonathan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the land before him. "Yes, but it's not just about the fire pits, it's about what they represent. This place, it's more than just survival. It's a new beginning." And with that, Jonathan knew that his legacy was not just the fire pit. It was the community, the lives that had been changed, the homes that had been built, and the future that had been forged in the heart of the mountains. He had started this journey alone, but now it was something far greater than any one man could claim. As the days turned to years, Jonathan's fire pits continued to burn, never faltering, no matter what the winds threw their way. And in every flicker of flame, there was a reminder of what one man could accomplish when driven by a desire not just to survive, but to change the world around him. It had been over a decade since Jonathan's fire pit had first lit up the cold mountain air, and the valley had flourished beyond his wildest dreams. The settlement had grown into a small but prosperous community, built on the foundations of innovation, perseverance, and a shared desire to thrive in the harshest of conditions. Jonathan had once walked into these mountains, a man determined to survive, but now he stood as the leader of a community, his creation a symbol of something greater than mere survival. Yet, despite the success, Jonathan often found himself in moments of quiet reflection, standing by the fire pits that had become as much a part of the land as the mountains themselves. The world around him had changed, and he had changed with it. The isolation he had once sought now felt distant, as the community he had helped build grew stronger and more self-sufficient with each passing year. The settlers no longer depended on him as they once had. They had their own fire pits now, their own knowledge, and their own survival. But Jonathan remained a guiding figure, his presence woven into the very fabric of the valley's existence. The fire pits, now known far and wide as Bridger's Pits, had become a symbol of hope not just for the settlers of the valley, but for anyone who faced the wilderness with the same determination Jonathan had once felt. The settlers had built their homes around the hearths, and now their children played near the warmth, their laughter filling the air that had once been silent but for the wind and the occasional howl of a distant animal. One day, as the sun began to dip behind the mountain peaks, Jonathan sat by the fire, the crackling warmth of the flames stirring memories of the early days, the solitude, the struggle, and the quiet triumph of seeing the fire burn in the face of the wind. It had been a long road, and sometimes he wondered if he had given up too much in pursuit of something that was never truly his to own. The fire pit, the community it all, seemed like something larger than him now, something that had taken on a life of its own. Benjamin, now an older man with graying hair and the same sharp determination in his eyes, sat down beside him. "I never thought it would end like this," Benjamin said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "You've built something that's lasted far longer than I ever imagined." Jonathan didn't respond at first, instead focusing on the flames that flickered and danced in the fire pit. The wind, which had once been his enemy, now seemed like an old companion. He had learned to respect it, to understand its ways. The fire, too, had become something he understood, its flickers and embers a constant reminder that no matter how fierce the winds, there was always something that could endure. "I didn't build this alone," Jonathan finally said, his voice low but filled with quiet pride. "It's the people who built it, the people who kept the flame alive." Benjamin nodded, the two men sitting together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn. The wind had died down, and the night air was cool and calm, a peaceful contrast to the storms that had once battered the valley. The fire pit still stood strong, as it always had, a symbol of resilience, of survival, and of the unyielding spirit of the mountain people. As the embers glowed in the fading light, Jonathan realized that his work was far from over. The fire would continue to burn, its flame never extinguished, because it was more than just a tool for survival. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, there was always light, always warmth, always a way to endure. And with that thought, Jonathan leaned back against the rocks, feeling the warmth of the fire against his skin, knowing that his legacy would live on long after he was gone.